everyone, welcome back to another episode of Zilog and Moto. If you're not familiar with the channel, my name is Dave, and I'm on a quest. No, not the Jean-Claude Van Damme quest, and no, not a quest for glory, but a quest to collect every English language Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X game, and then not just hoard them like Smog, but to play and review them, and then share my experience with all of you great people. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in hearing more about, I'd heartily recommend that you subscribe. And to all of those of you that are returning viewers out there that have already subscribed, you're awesome. I can't tell you how happy I am that the channel is officially into triple digits now. It makes my day anytime I go in and see that number go up even just one digit. Okay, enough about all that. I got a complaint the other day that my intros were too long. And that's probably true, but I can't help it. I like to talk about this stuff. And between you and me, if you want to skip around, by all means. I'm just glad you're here. Anyway, for this week's review, it's time to look at a game for a console that should have been so much more popular, at least in the United States, and that's the Master System. I will die on the hill that the Master System is technically a better console than the NES. You can't convince me otherwise. Pause button on the controller or no. Okay, I mean, the pause button on the controller is pretty cool, I've got to admit, but still. The Master System's failure in the United States is an old story, but this week's game comes from the early in the console's lifespan when we were still getting releases for the console in the United States, and the Mega Drive was still just being derived from Sega's System 16 arcade hardware. And that game is Kung Fu Kid. Kung Fu Kid made its way to the United States in October of 1987, about 5 months after its debut in Japan, and a year after the console's release, just in time for the 1987 Christmas season. Despite the fact that there's not a 2 in the title of the game, Kung Fu Kid is not the first game in the series. For that, you have to go back to Sega's previous console, the SG-1000. And for those of you saying, Sega had a console before the Master System? Well, it's understandable to be a bit confused, as the SG-1000 was only released in Asia and a few other nearby regions. I've brought the SG-1000 up a few times on this channel before, as 2 previous games I've looked at are arcade ports, Choplifter in episode 47 and the Ninja in episode 99, also got versions on the SG-1000. I've made the case before that I'm not covering the SG-1000 library because it didn't get a US or European release. But let's be honest, we all know the reason why I'm not covering it. Yeah. I've got enough trouble tracking this stuff down. Sorry, got off topic there for a bit. Anyway, the history of Kung Fu Kid goes back to a game called Dragon Wang, which was released for the SG-1000 in 1985. Dragon Wang shares a similar 2D style with Kung Fu Kid, some similar looking enemies, and of course the main character Wang. You don't really need to know anything about Dragon Wang to enjoy Kung Fu Kid, but it is kind of cool to see that it isn't just some random game, and it does come from somewhere. Okay, that's definitely an overlong intro, I'm sure, but we've covered a lot of things. Let's get to the package and see where Sega screwed up with the Western release, because you know they did. Here's my copy of Kung Fu Kid, and you can immediately see it's certainly not in the best condition. Could be way worse, though. For whatever reason, it feels like there's a higher percentage of beat-up copies of US versions of games versus the Euro versions, and I thought about why that was for a bit. The only thing that really makes sense to me is that there's probably more copies out there of the PAL releases, so it's easier to find a copy of the game that's in good condition. As it can't be that American kids were harder on their games than European ones, right? Right? I probably don't want the answer to that question. Anyway, looking at the front cover, there's some pretty clear water damage to the inner cover at the top, and then if you flip over to the back, there's some more at the bottom. Now, I don't know how they managed to get the top of the front and the bottom of the back wet. Maybe it was 2 different spills, but I guess I should just be glad it's not worse than it is. The top of the spine is broken off as well, in a fairly odd break. I don't think I've seen that happen before, and as a result, the inner and outer cover has a slight tear as well. Finally, the hang tab has been removed, but at least that was a clean circumcision that didn't leave any jagged edges. But other than all that, it's held up pretty well for an almost 35-year-old game. Next is my favorite topic when talking about these early Master System games, and I know that you all never get tired of hearing me rant about this, But the cover art. Yeah. This art actually isn't that bad by this era's standards, but it's still oddly simplistic. No details to the namesake Kung Fu Kid's face, and he apparently has one white foot and one black foot. Also, he's a holder of that widely sought after and respected teal belt? Okay, well, you knew this was coming. Here's the Japanese cover of the game. And while even it's a hot mess, with all four characters being depicted seemingly by a different art style, this is still light years ahead of the US and European copies. And as an additional kick in the teeth, here's the cover to the previous game in the series, Dragon Wang, and even it looks better despite it being a much more primitive game. Finally, just for completeness sake, one last comparison, and that's the Brazilian ripoff variant, Sapo Chuli o Mestre do Kung Fu, which just goes to show that in Brazil, it totally makes sense to re-release the exact same game years later, but with a cartoon frog instead. Yeah. Flipping over the back, and it's the standard early Master System US formatting with two screenshots at the top, and then a paragraph of flavor text below. The screenshots are both nice and colorful, and I like how they use two completely different levels. Also, as much as I rip on the front covers, usually the flavor text is pretty great to make up for it, and that's certainly the case here. Check out this line. Armed with the mysterious and traditional talisman, your talents are the only defense against the wicked Badanda, the most dreaded creature ever to live. Ah yeah, that's how you sell a game. Opening up the case, and the cartridge has a little label wear, and the manual is slightly creased, but they both could be a lot worse. The manual itself is decent and explains the game, and unlike many other Master System manuals, has a scoring table and some nice hand-drawn art. I always enjoy seeing both of those. Sega certainly didn't have to include either, but knowing the names of the characters and how many points they'd be worth draws you into the game a lot more than just killing random nameless enemies. Okay, that's the physical portion. Let's get to the game and see if the sequel to Dragon Wang is flaccid or tumescent. Kung Fu Kid is a game, much like most of the Master System releases, where I'm playing it for the first time this week for the review. I can't remember if I'd even heard of it before I started collecting for the console. To be fair, there were tons of games that I didn't know existed for the Master System, including even reasonably well-known titles like The Ninja that I looked at back in episode 99. That's just how the situation was for the Master System in the United States. Pretty much unless it was a port of a popular arcade game like Outrun or Space Harrier, most people didn't know these games existed over here. And even then, when you had a game like Wonder Boy, people were familiar with Hudson's Adventure Island on the NES instead. And I've got to say, playing Wonder Boy on the Master System back in episode 51 for the first time was one of the most shocking things I've experienced so far on this channel, as it was a better version of a game that I grew up with thinking it was iconic for the NES. And this is one of the reasons why I think targeting all of the games is so important, because there's just so many that either flew under the radar or weren't released to the United States at all that are being missed out on. Granted, there's also trash like Back to the Future 2, but we don't need to discuss that. Martial arts / kung fu / karate, etc. was huge in the 1980s, with action stars like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal coming out of seemingly nowhere dominating the theaters. But of course that was on the top of work laid by people like Jackie Chan and Chuck Norris. But I've got to think that video games were at least somewhat responsible for that martial arts boom, with titles like Renegade and Double Dragon drawing in the quarters. But before those brawlers hit the arcades, the martial arts / action genre got its start with some strictly 2D games. Titles like ER Kung Fu and Karate Champ were early entrants, but they focused more on one-on-one fights, made popular in the US by The Karate Kid in 1984. Rather than focusing on mano-a-mano competition, about the same time Irem and Data East in the United States created an iconic arcade game of their own, Kung Fu Master. I specifically have fond memories of playing that in the local Quickie Mart, back when they used to have arcade machines. Nintendo jumped on the popularity of Kung Fu Master and released their own version shortened to just Kung Fu, and it was part of the original black box line of NES titles. Sega, I'm guessing for reasons related to Nintendo's well-documented 8-bit shenanigans with publishers, weren't able to jump in on the Kung Fu Master Parade, so instead Sega said, screw it, we'll make our own Kung Fu Master with blackjack and hookers. Okay, maybe not the blackjack and hookers, but you get the idea. And so Kung Fu Kid was born. Kung Fu Kid is a relatively simple game at its core. Being a strictly 2D title, you move left and right as you navigate your way through 7 stages to ultimately fight the evil Madanda in the Lion's Castle. The first 6 levels see you making your way through different areas such as the outdoors, a temple, and fire and water theme levels, before having to face a gauntlet in level 6 that allows access to the Lion's Castle and that final showdown. However, if you think that based on that description, that Kung Fu Kid is just a warmed over version of Kung Fu Master, don't worry, it's not, and it's decidedly improved upon from that original formula. From strictly a gameplay perspective, Kung Fu Kid improves upon Kung Fu Master by having levels that don't always go in one direction. Sure, some levels are straight dashes to the right side and eventual confrontation with that level's boss, but then there are also levels that have you going right and left, as well as up and down. How does that work with a 2D game? Well, with the introduction of the wall jump, something that was borrowed and made popular by Ninja Gaiden upon its release in 1988. I'm not sure if Kung Fu Kid was the first game to feature a wall jump mechanic, but it's definitely one of the first. Using wall jumping, you're able to navigate Wang upwards into the levels, allowing the game to extend levels vertically instead of horizontally. This is a great feature, and I really wish it had been expanded upon and used more than just the 3rd and 5th levels. But hey, at least it's there. Beyond just simply making it through the levels to the end boss, Wang will be busy taking on enemies that appear both in front and behind him. To aid him against these enemies, Wang can kick. A lot. He can either use a standard high kick, he can duck and sweep, or he can sky high into the air and drop down from the heavens with a jump kick. However, Wang also has another attack, one that is somewhat confusingly explained in the manual as using a talisman. However, don't think of the talisman as what you or I would probably think of a talisman, which is some sort of ornate object usually attached to a necklace. In the case of Kung Fu Kid, what the talisman is referring to is essentially Wang turning into Gambit from the X-Men and using a projectile attack in front of him that looks like he's throwing a playing card to wipe out all enemies in that direction. To collect ammo for the talisman, you must take out enemies with your kicks, and occasionally a talisman icon will appear on your screen for you to jump up and grab, which will give you 5 shots. The manual warns you not to use your talisman on the level bosses, and this is accurate, as the only way to take them out is with your feet, with the talisman only having an effect on normal enemies. Now, here's where I go into a rant about one of the things I think is the most annoying about 8-bit titles, and that's the concept of hidden items. Now, let me be clear, if it's a hidden item that either just makes the game easier, or the game gives you clues as where to find them, that I don't really have a problem with. But if it's an item that's really necessary to complete the game, and then I've got a bit of an issue with that. And for whatever reason, it seems like it was acceptable game design back then, and a way to extend the game's lifespan. This I don't agree with whatsoever. Yeah, now we have the internet, and most of the time this information is out there, but that's not always the case. And specifically in Kung Fu Kid, I know there's some instances of hidden items in level 5 that no one seems to know about, assuming the manual isn't wrong and they were actually included in the game anyway. The reason why I bring all this up is that when you're going through level 5, you're introduced to the zombie enemy. And these enemies not only take 2 hits, but then they'll simply become stunned and still hurt you if you touch them. The best way to deal with them is to store up the talisman shots in the first 4 levels, and then basically blast your way through them during the entire level. However, if you didn't get the hidden talisman power-up in level 2, that is gained by killing a certain lobster in a specific point of the level, your talisman isn't quite as effective against the enemies as it should be. You can still make it through the level with this strategy, but you definitely have to be a bit more careful. Maybe there's some people out there that really enjoy having to search out all parts of a level for the items that may or may not exist,
but that's just frustrating to me, and I can imagine kids being annoyed by this to no end 35 years ago when it was originally released. From a graphics perspective, Kung Fu Kid delivers. Yes, it technically has much smaller characters than, say, Kung Fu Master, at least the arcade version anyway. It makes up for that in detail. Each of the 7 levels has a very different look from one another, and you're never in a situation where you're dealing with repeated assets, aside from the enemies. But even the enemies vary a bit over the course of the game, and along with the different backgrounds and level layouts, give each of the levels their own feel. I don't want to oversell the graphics in the game as it's clearly a 1 megabit title from 1987, but I really like the use of color in the game. Each of the levels are bright, and certain elements, like the dragon mural at the end of level 5, or the lightning and the clouds in the final level, look really impressive. There's some flickering when a lot of enemies are on the same line on the screen that the Master System is known for, but it doesn't detract from the game too much. The game doesn't feature a ton of animation to the characters, but I did like how when the enemies are defeated, not only are they knocked back, but they also apparently are atomized by turning into a bunch of pixels. Wang's got a hell of a kick, apparently. On the audio front, Kung Fu Kid is okay. The background music, for whatever reason, is the same in both the first and second levels, which worried me a bit at first, but then the levels start to get their own music. It's all fine and fairly standard early 8-bit, nothing I think anyone will get too excited about, but not anything that'll make you mute your TV either. Kung Fu Kid is not one of the Master System games with an optional enhanced FM soundtrack, so if your way of playing doesn't involve that, don't worry, you're not missing out on anything. The sound effects aren't anything special either, just the usual explosion white noise during combat, and rings for picking up items. Kung Fu Kid isn't going to be for everyone. It's an early Master System title, and looks and plays like it. Also, once you know what you're doing, the patterns for the various bosses, and where all the hidden items are, you're probably going to be able to run through the game in 20 minutes or so, and that's factoring in a few deaths along the way. But I'll say this, when playing the game this week, after the first hour or so when I learned the game's mechanics and really started to dial in the timing necessary to take out enemies before they get to you, the game started to become pretty fun, and I enjoyed making my way through the levels. Nailing a perfectly timed hit on a lobster or frog to see it go flying and taking out any other enemies in that direction is always incredibly satisfying. Due to its relatively early release on the console, I'm giving Kung Fu Kid 3 stars, and I think it pairs well with the Ninja when it comes to Master System action titles. However, if you wanted to argue it down to a 2-star rating, I wouldn't put up much of a fight, as these ratings are subjective, and you may not be a fan of action titles. The game is relatively short, and if I gave out half-star ratings, I'd probably more accurately say it's 2.5 stars, but since I don't, 3 stars it is.
Okay, that was Kung Fu Kid for the Master System. This is one of those games that really shows the importance of putting some time into the game. If I just rated the game based on the first 30 minutes of playtime, when I was struggling to get past the first boss, this probably would have been a solid bomb entry on the Zilog and Moto scale, but when I got to about the hour mark, the game started to click, and I found myself really wanting to keep pushing towards the end and having fun, which is about all I can ask from one of these older titles. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's back to the Sega CD. 2 Sega CD reviews in 3 weeks? Craziness, I know, but this is a game that's actually been on the schedule for 2 years, as I looked at the Genesis version of the game back in episode 10 to tie in with my rule of 100 episodes between sequels and alternate versions. This is actually a Sega CD game that I've had for a while now, and was actually the first Sega CD game that I used to test what FMV would look like on my current setup. It was a little rough, yeah. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!